Alright, so scanning lesson. First lesson. This is, as we talked about earlier, the Artec Spider. It uses a time of flight method, so it's actually got two different sensors on here. It captures textures as well as the structure of the geometry. Artec refers to it as structured light. Other people call it time of flight. Basically, it's sending out a pulse of light, and it watches to see that light reflected back. And based on how long it takes for that light to reflect back, it determines where that point is in space. And what makes this device so unique is that it takes that measurement and figures that out in a space of about 200 millimeters. The light moves really fast. I don't know about you, but my mind is boggled by how small that number is that this thing's able to work with. Now this is our piece, and we're going to start with the skull. Um, it won't actually present a lot of challenges except, as I was talking about earlier, these really deep orbital sockets. Now the Artec is never going to be able to get that sinus cavity that goes all the way through the skull like a shotgun. It'll get in a pretty good ways, but it's just, that's one of its limitations. It doesn't really do deep cavities like that. Um, the finished model is going to have this sealed off. It'll be watertight. But let's get started. Now usually what I do, and you can see on my screen back here, what's going on with Artec Studio, and I'll talk about the software more in depth in a little bit. Right now it's in scan mode, and the scanner is warmed up and ready to go. If I push up on the trigger, it initializes the scan. You can see on the monitor back here, I'm getting a preview of what the scanner would see. Now this little square represents the patch of light that it's recording. This histogram over here represents how much of what it sees and how much of what it sees is within its active range, which is about 170 millimeters to about 330 millimeters. You want to keep everything within that range. If I get too close to the model, it stops being able to see it. If I get too far away from the model, it also stops being able to see it, and it does something called losing tracking. It can't figure out where the model is in relation to the scanner anymore, so it stops tracking. When that happens, the screen will flash red. It'll make this annoying beeping noise. I'm sure you're going to be hearing that a lot of times because that's usually when I stop a scan, is when I lost tracking. If sometimes it can reacquire tracking, and if it's easy to reacquire the tracking, I will try. That invariably introduces bad frames into my scan. This will take several scans. It's going to be a multi-step process. I'll scan a bit over here, spin it around, scan a bit over here. And that's one of the reasons I like to do my mounts on this sort of, this is actually a cake decorating table, tray, platform thing. Other people use Lazy Susans. There are actually devices that are made just to do this, to make it, make the action very smooth and stable. Um, I think I paid $3 for this one, so, and I've really got my money's worth out of it. And then we'll use the software to take all of those individual scans and mesh them back together. So I'll start an actual scan on this side of the skull. Now once I start the scan, it's the last time I'm going to look at the piece. I'll use the screen itself to guide how I move the spider, because it's going to give me a lot of information about how the scan is progressing. And for some reason, if I ever look at I can't tell what the scanner is doing if I'm looking at the skull. I can't see the line of sight that it's directing, and this flash is sort of distracting me, so I can't tell what part of the skull the scanner is actually looking at. I only see that by keeping my eyes on the screen. Sort of like, it's like learning to type without looking at your fingers, or playing the piano without looking at your fingers. It's the same thing. So I'm actually scanning now, and you might not be able to see it with this camera shot, but once I actually go into the software, you'll see this green line that I'm talking about. So there's a green line that goes around the geometry that it's scanning from frame to frame. I'm also getting a little bit of the platform that the skull is sitting on itself. I'm just going to turn it a little bit. And as the scan progresses, you can see how it's sort of filling in the geometry wherever it sees it. Now this is actually not a mesh. It's a combination of point data and textures. So it looks at a point, locates that point in space, figures out what color that point is, and just sort of stores all that. Now it always takes it a couple of seconds while it does the initial processing on the raw data. And here's our first scan. So here's our first scan of the deer skull. And as I mentioned earlier, it's all just point data. Eventually we'll merge all these point clouds together and mesh those point clouds over into a surface with an accuracy of about 1/10 of a millimeter. So I'm going to pick up the scanner and start scanning again from a different side of the skull. Here's the preview, starting on one of those tricky orbital sockets. I'm probably going to be taking lots of pictures of these eyes to try and get every surface on the inside. I also want to get enough of the antlers so that when I'm merging the two projects together, I have plenty to work with. Try and get all these little crevices. Now that green line that you see sort of going around the geometry, it looks like the line is almost building the geometry as it comes in. I'm looking at the quality of that line because that's telling me how the scan is progressing in a lot of ways. If that line's relatively clean and it quickly is grabbing a bunch of stuff and bringing it in, then I know everything's going right. Ooh, did you hear that flash? I almost lost tracking. You can lose tracking if you move the model too quickly, which I just did right there. So, slow, purposeful movements, much like swimming. So I'm still scanning on the a different part of the skull. I started another scan after I lost tracking, and I just lost tracking again there. The antler actually got in the way, so this part of the skull is going to be really tricky to get because the antler comes out horizontally so far that it puts the piece of the skull I'm trying to scan out of view of the scanner. Some scans are going to be larger than others. If you look up in the corner, right under the 7.1 frames per second, it sees where it says surfaces recorded, 42, 46, now it's 70, 80, 90, so that number's always going up. That is the number of frames of data that it's captured. So every flash of light, every frame of data, it accumulates into an individual scan of point data. I'm slowly coming down the side of the skull, trying to get the nose. I want to get as far up inside the sinuses as I can. I know I'm not going to get every bit of it all the way up in there. I see I lost tracking for just a second, but was able to reacquire. Sometimes you have to put pieces of geometry around your subject if it's really hard for the scanner to register on it. Long, skinny things like this this nose. Oh, and I got part of my hand. It's okay. I can get all that out. It's also getting part of the table, part of the platform that it's on. We'll erase all that extra stuff out. For now, it actually can be kind of helpful. Even if a scan is going well, I usually stop it after about 500 surfaces or so, just to make it a manageable size. The total size of the project is going to be really big. These things can take up gigabytes of hard drive space. but we'll optimize them down to something manageable as part of this process. And we can go over here. I've already taken several scans. Scan 3 was that one that really short one that messed up on me. But they're all, this one's almost a gig in size, well over half a gig. And they all have some sort of data that we're going to have to trim out of them. And I'll show you the process of doing that. The quality indicator over here on the side represents the confidence that the software has both in the geometry and in the textures. If I double click on any one of these and look inside, I'll see a collection of frames. Some of these frames have a higher quality or a lower quality than others, and not all of them have textures. I can actually play through the frames like a movie and see the scans that it's captured and which frames are surface and which frames are surface and texture as it goes through. One thing I should say about the quality, the higher the number, the less confidence the software has. So what you're shooting for is a 0, and these numbers will go up and down as we process this data. There's different steps that you can go through the software to sort of actually improve the raw data from the scan that it collected. If I look on one of these, okay, well, I haven't seen what I was going to show you yet, but I'm sure I will. So I'm going to stop the video for a little bit, finish scanning in the skull, and then the next video we'll talk about cleaning up the raw data and starting to build a mesh out of it.